Hello and welcome to this video on why all the depictions of recovery in media tend to be at best slightly wrong and often very wrong. How many times can you think of where a scene such as that from Akira occurs? The scene where something starts to heal right after injury and recovers within moments. An organism begins to grow like you see in evolution. The character or being grows in size instantly without being inflated. These are all the same basic phenomena. The regrowth or growth of cells on not just a fast time scale, but at a massive volume. These two things are a problem. Individually, either one can be achieved. Given enough time, anything can grow, and obviously, the smaller something is, the faster it can heal. Think of this. You catch the common cold or influenza. You end up falling rather ill. You're obviously going to feel tired and like crap because you not just have widespread tissue damage from the virus causing cells to die, but you need to replace these cells. And there's an explosion in your leukocytes as they try and find something that matches with this pathogen and kill it off. This is though of course still at a relatively low level by comparison to something more direct, such as a wound or growth in size. In short, what you experience personally with a pathogen like the common cold or influenza is a much more mild version of what happens in these scenarios. So just imagine how you feel and multiply it by arguably thousands of times. If we take just the most basic approach to this problem, you might have a better understanding. What we're going to use is fairly basic physics. Assuming that the equation E = mc squared is true at face value, we can convert human mass into energy. 1 kilogram of flesh that needs to be healed, grown, or replaced is more or less equal to 9 times 10 to the 16th power in joules. Okay, that sounds like a big number, but a big number without comparison or context is somewhat useless. The USA uses about 3 by 10 to the 12th power in joules each year. You can imagine how the sudden appearance of the equivalent of roughly 30,000 years of USA power generation in mere moments for just 1 kilogram of a body is just not feasible, and we mean that in the most literal sense. So we know the energy needed to make this possible is impossible, but your next thought is, well, what about the stored resources? Yes, this is certainly going to lower that energy requirement, but the human body, or amorphous terrifying blob mass, only has so much raw material available to replace what has been lost. Your body, and for that matter any other being, can only hold so much stored energy in the form of fat, amino acids for making proteins, readily metabolizable saccharides, lipids, and the list could go on. So let's try using the average human body's composition to see what we would need and how much energy would need to be used in making up the remainder from pure energy, essentially the reverse of E = mc squared. If you take the human and divide it into parts, we get 4.2% in erythrocytes or red blood cells, 28.6% in muscles, 18.6% in adipose tissue, 14.3% in other cells, and 34.3% in extracellular components. And to make life easy, let's just say that this is the exact distribution of the lost tissue. And that means we can say you need 42 grams of red blood cells, at least the material to make them, 286 grams of material to make a muscle, 186 grams of lipids, 143 and 343 grams of other materials. If we also assume you're not including water, we can lower this value by a flat 65%. That means we will need, in practice, 14.7 grams of red blood cell material, 100 grams of muscle-related material, 65 grams of lipids, 50.5 and 120 grams of either other cells or extracellular content. To avoid just throwing pointless numbers at you, here is the exact way each of these parts breaks down as far as a reasonable approximation goes. To maintain and replace proteins in a physically active body, you need between 1 and 1.6 grams of protein a day. This equates to roughly 110 grams of chicken per day, and you get between 24 and 32 grams of amino acids to make the protein required in total for the human body. Under the right circumstances, your body can find this, but beyond that basic volume, it's not really possible and you need to consume extra protein in the form of food. This leaves us without any other issues a deficit of 66 grams of protein, remembering that these individuals not just heal, but heal to the point they were before injury, so we can't just say they're taking protein out of other muscles and redirecting it. You are literally having to replace what's been lost without harming anything that hasn't been damaged. For the ease of this, let's say the major thing your body's replacing with blood is going to be iron for hemoglobin and protein for both the cell and the hemoglobin. Blood weighs roughly 1 gram per 1 milliliter, or more or less an ounce of liquid weight to an ounce of fluid volume. Each milliliter of blood contains approximately 0.212 milligrams of iron. We need to get the equivalent of 14.7 grams of blood, which is roughly 13.86 grams of blood, as we'll need 2.77 grams of iron to make the hemoglobin. The typical range for ferritin, or the basic iron for blood, is approximately 11 to 336 micrograms per litre of blood, and the human body has up to 8 litres of blood, so let's say 2,688 micrograms of ferritin, which is 2.688 milligrams. This is roughly 0.0026 grams, and therefore just under 1/10 of 1% of what is needed. In other words, we still need to find 2.5 grams of iron somewhere. Further, you need roughly 68.52 grams of amino acids for every 100 grams of red blood cells. We need 14.7 grams of red blood, so this number is 10.07 grams of protein. This is on top of the already mentioned shortage of protein, so we can add this to the effective deficit that we've established so far for protein. Next we have lipids. Humans are more or less 18.6% lipid, although if you're American this number is significantly higher. So we can say that you need, at least for an average person, 186 grams of lipids. This is adjusted as most adipose tissue we're talking about is roughly 61% lipids for the purpose of this video, and making the strongest case for this to work, we'll go with that number. And that means we need 113.5 grams of lipids. The normal volume of triglycerides in your blood is 2 millimoles per litre, or roughly 1.7 grams of triglycerides per litre of blood. The average human has 8 litres of blood, so we get 13.66 grams of triglycerides, or a shortfall of just under 100 grams of lipids at 99.8 grams. For the remaining two categories, things are a bit more complicated and not easily split into somewhat neat categories as we have so far. Let's operate on the simple assumption that the vast majority of this is going to be connective tissue when we look at what's going on with the extracellular material, and we can say that 30% of the 50 grams is roughly accounted for, as it is a protein, and we long since run out of protein in the human body, so that's another 15.5 grams of protein debt. That leaves 70% mineral content that we can look at that could be part of the skeleton. And this latter point is slightly more difficult as most minerals are stored in the bones. The exception is some calcium, zinc, phosphor and a few other minerals, but let's work with just the calcium for now. The average human has a skeleton that weighs about 10 kilograms. Of this, between 2 and 3 kilograms are made up of calcium. We need roughly 84 grams of calcium here from the 2 to 3 kilograms. You can lose up to 20% of your bone mineral content before it is considered osteoporosis, but that is already at a risk of fracture, so a more modest figure of 10% is appropriate, and even then we would argue we are pushing things. 84 grams is very close to 5% of a 2 kilogram calcium mass, and 2.8% of a 3 kilogram skeleton mineral mass. This means it's likely to work if all mineral in a skeleton is available. Even then, we would argue it still fails to some extent, mostly because, as mentioned before, we are taking mineral away from other parts of the body and redirecting it to make up for the loss, which is simply unsustainable if you do this more than once or need to replace more than 1 kilogram of mass. The other possibility is that there is roughly 8 milligrams of calcium in blood, but that also means we can't rely on that either, more so since it would also interfere with things like muscle function, and, well, that obviously isn't the case, as most of the things that we are talking about tend to function pretty damn well physically, even after they've replaced whatever they've lost. And last we have extracellular content, and the big players in this category are proteins. This includes collagen at 30%, elastin, fibronectin, and a range of other proteins and minerals. And this will obviously repeat the previously mentioned issues with protein. We also have a similar issue with the extracellular matrix minerals. We can definitely say there's a shortage of at least 36 grams of protein, and likely minerals on top of this again. This brings us to a slight hiccup. The deficits we've listed so far come to a total shortage of 2.06 by 10 to the 16th joules in power useful to pull out of nowhere. 2 by 10 to the 16 is still a lot of energy, and, to be very clear about it, we are talking somewhere closer to what the USA is using each year still. So yeah, not a good sign. The last issue we're going to describe is, well, it's not really quantifiable, but arguably we could do so, but it's unnecessary. We're making a throwback to an earlier video we made, the square cube law. That is, as you get bigger, the surface area decreases as a relative percentage compared to the volume. Simply put, the bigger something gets, the less surface area for it to get or remove things through. Why this is important is that if they were to grow something in size, despite the aforementioned issues, so if we were to ignore those for a moment, it would be unable to support its own weight as the size goes up. Eventually, it would just collapse under its own mass. It's simply unable to physically support itself after a certain size is achieved. This issue is more pronounced as the organism lacks resources needed to make the new parts with anything approaching normal strength alongside everything else as well. So not only do we have basic biological processes and physics saying this doesn't work, but even if through some mechanism there was a way for it to be able to make up new parts and fit them in there that would be able to support that extra mass, there aren't the resources to make those new parts. This is why you can't just recover from an injury, increase in size, or really anything else. Your body just does not have the resources required, and it can't make the needed resources. It simply lacks the requisite energy, and even if it had the requisite energy, the amount we're talking about being released would probably cook you before you actually grew. It's something that is physically impossible, biologically impossible, and defies the laws of physics when it comes to conservation of energy. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.